I'm Gary Nickerson,
And I'm Quinn Taggart.
and this is Outside My Window. The devastating wildfire in Shelburne County has destroyed homes, uprooted people's lives, forcing many to seek shelter elsewhere, and many still don't know if their home survived. How do folks deal with the emotions after a calamity of such proportions? To help us try and get a sense of that, we're joined by Bertha Brannen. She is a retired registered nurse and a grief recovery specialist. Bertha, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
On a personal note, Bertha, how has this tragedy affected you? I know you know a lot of people in the area.
I do. However, the way that it has affected me is minimal compared to the huge grief response that it certainly has created in a lot of families, community and families. I would like to sort of start by saying that grief, of course, is not just about death. Grief is about many, many losses. And what we have realized over the last few years is that there have been different things that have happened in the province of Nova Scotia that have created a grief response in all of us that we may or may not have identified as a response. And COVID, of course, was, the big one for a lot of people that we're already feeling a little bit off our game, so to speak. The other thing was Portapic, that even though we may not have been directly involved or known some of the people, certainly the tragedy that hit the province affected all of us in sort of having a grief response. And more recently, the financial hardships that a lot of people are having because of inflation and the economy. So the wildfires were the added, frosting on the cake is not a good analogy, but certainly it was for a lot of people who are already feeling the pain, the suffering of loss. This was definitely an added loss. One of the things that we know that helps people recover, and I do a fair amount of research and work with the Grief Recovery Institute and so on, and there is the sense out there that every tragedy can be overcome, whether it's you're dealing with children or with adults. And the key there is to acknowledge the loss. It's not to go to the myths that our society has had for years, that we need to be strong, grieve alone, don't cry, keep busy, time heals. It's about acknowledging that this is, for some people, the most difficult loss that they will have to face. And even though we were very, very, very thankful that there was no loss of life with the evacuees or with the firefighters, the frontline staff who had to be physically, emotionally drained and were still facing such huge fights, so to speak. So thankful for that, but also thankful for the community that has rallied, because it is by supporting one another that we will move forward. Not quickly, there's a lot to process, but we can move forward from this tragedy with support, with acknowledging that this is most difficult, and with leaning on one another.
Most people have dealt with grief in terms of a loss of a loved one. But this is entirely different, this catastrophe. To have to evacuate your home, there's not much time to process anything. So folks are leaving their home, they're going perhaps to a hall or a fire hall or an arena, away from their home, away from that comfort zone. How does one even begin to process that at that stage?
Well, again, I will go back to, you can't process it unless you acknowledge that this is difficult. And it's, again, like with support. When we're talking about loss of a home, there are many losses that people don't recognize. We're all familiar with somebody dies that we love, of course. We're going to have support. We're going to, grieve. Loss of a home is huge. It's up there. And the other thing is, what we're all aware of. Some people still have their homes, but they're entering a community that's been devastated or wiped clean. So there's also an element of guilt, which again triggers a grief response, because as human beings, sometimes we can be guilty even though we shouldn't be. It's not, we're not in control. So again, I would encourage people to find support from one another with people that will not tell them how lucky they were that nobody died, or, that people will acknowledge all of the heavy emotions that are bound to, creep into your brain and will stay there if you don't express it, if you don't spit it out, if you don't share it. And, grief is a journey of the brain, but mostly it's a journey of the heart. There's many, many aches. And even though if I've lost my house and you've lost your house, there's still different responses, because it's directly based on the relationship that you have with that home. Is it the family home? Is it a home that you weren't happy with, or you were planning to move? Or is it a home like Quinn was saying, that has so many memories and artifacts and things that belong to your grandfather and great-grandfather?
In your experience, how do children process this type of situation, the anxiety and stress and grief, differently than adults?
The quick and dirty answer to that would be better than adults. But it depends on the age, of course. But children, and I did have the privilege of talking to a teenager, preteen probably, asking what was the worst part about being evacuated and the best part. The best part really stayed with me. She said it was spending more time with my family. The other thing I would say is that children will respond in direct relationship to what the parents or the adults around, what their response is. We're going to do this together. We're going to move forward. We're going to help ourselves by taking one day at a time, sometimes just one step at a time. So a lot of it depends on the attitude of the people, the adults that are around. And so I think, everybody has kind of followed Facebook. Sean Hatfield, for me, has been very instrumental in getting people to look at some of the fun side, if you can even call it fun, but some has been focusing on some people, the 99-year-old guy who's got this positive attitude. He's lost everything, including his wife several years ago. So attitude is huge. But in processing, it also means that we need to talk and allow kids to talk. And one of the things, if the kids are young, is to write the story about what it was like for them, a story that would be of interest in other communities with other kids, but also help them express what they're really feeling. Writing, coloring, talking, crying, to be encouraged, because we know that tears process the heavy chemicals, toxic chemicals that come on board when we're grieving. And also finding some things in the middle of the tragedy that can lift our spirits, some creative activity, even if it's just downloading a playlist of your favorite music and or looking at comedy. In the grief world, we say that what we're grieving is all based on the past and the future. If we can think about where we are in the present, it helps us sort of stay grounded. Does that make sense, Gary?
Everybody's response to grief is as different as everything else. But are there some commonalities that we should be on the lookout for in being able to support folks? I mean, certainly the first thing that people say, are you doing all right?
Right.
What do you need?
Yeah.
If you need anything, ask.
Right.
But a lot of people
won't ask.
Won't ask.
Yeah.
either because they just feel too proud to ask for help, or feel that I got it. I got to look after
I'm
this.
strong. I can grieve alone.
I can deal with this, and then they find out no, they can't. So what kind of commonalities should we be on the lookout for with our family and friends in the next little while, where we may be able to interject ourselves into it and be able to help out?
Definitely, you're right that it is an individual journey. The way that I'm going to process grief, even if I've had the same loss as my neighbor, is going to be different. But the commonalities are this. Initially, there's a numb feeling in a sense that we get an abundance of stress hormones, cortisol, different hormones that will, and chemicals that come on board and kind of help us through what we call the buffer system, giving us a chance to kind of accept the reality that this really has happened, that it can't be undone, even though we'd like to scream it undone. We do know that the stress hormone cortisol creates 3 different reactions in the body. And the first one is that it does affect the way we think. It does make us have more of a tendency to go to negative thinking. Some people describe it as I'm numb. Some people have said over the years, people that I've been talking with for years will say, I'm not myself. I'm just not myself. I don't get it. And I will always try to say as kindly as I can, you are yourself, but you're yourself in grief. It's a process. It's a response. The second thing we know that happens with grief is that it affects our digestion. Some people can't eat. Some people can't stop. Long term, we are concerned about if we're just shoving these emotions down and not sharing them and not moving forward by writing or by talking or by crying, is that it can weaken our immune system. And so maybe not next week or next month, or maybe not even next year, but we know that a weakened immune system can lead to mental and physical disease. And that's why we need to talk about this stuff, because our suffering will be exaggerated by pretending we're okay. And again, some days that's what's going to get us through, by pretending we're okay. It's not black and white. But it's also about acknowledging that if we bury this, someday it's going to come up. And someday could be when you don't want it to.
That brings up post-traumatic stress. People, have used that a bit as a buzzword in the last little while for a variety of different events within their lives. But what's the difference? When you're looking at mental health as a whole,
right?
If you're trying to process a bit of a situation, if you delay the response, does it make it worse?
I tell you, for some people, I'll go back and say this, Quinn. Some people will say, well, they're in denial. For me, there's no such word as denial applying to grief. People do the best they can in the circumstances that they're facing. So let's not judge, because everybody is different. On the average, if we use the tools that are available, which are minimal, talking, crying, writing, and doing some things that might soothe us, if you look at the research, the average grief response, and a grief response to a death or to a loss of a home, on the average, is 2 years. It doesn't mean that life is going to be uneventful for those next 2 years, because as you and I both know, there's other tragedies that come along. So if I'm just moving along past my, what we call the buffer system, or the buffer phase, and I'm on my 3 to 9 month recovery, and this is the roller coaster, when some days I'm good and other days I'm mad, I'm sad, I'm everything. Not everybody is mad, but some people do go through that. Something else happens, then of course I'm delaying. But what we do try to tell people is this: if you don't process these emotions, we're talking years, we're talking decades of burying this. What has happened to some people is because we've been brought up to be strong and to just, suck it up being the most recent stuff, is that as human beings, we're going to medicate our pain because that's what human beings do. So if we medicate our pain by being at work all the time, people applaud that. Doesn't mean we're getting healthier. And there's other ways we medicate our pain. It's either alcohol, drugs,
Food.
gambling, sex, pornography, overspending, all of these things. So if we're using all of these medications, we call it, instead of processing how we're feeling, then we're going to delay it for a long, long time. Although I hate to say that there's a good thing in this fire, I will point out that the fact that there's so many people going through the same thing at the same time is not a bad thing, in a sense that if you have lost your home in a fire and you're the only one, then you're likely going to deal with that with your small circle of support. And the more support we get, the better. So there is one small positive thing in that, is that there's a huge number of people that are feeling what you're feeling. And if it's not your family that you want to vent to, and sometimes the family's not the best one because they want to fix you, never mind, don't worry about that. That doesn't help. We use the word scream it undone. So sometimes it's a support group that will help. Somebody that's not going to try to fix you because they love you and they hate to see you sad.
We hear sometimes about the stages of grief. Can you briefly just kind of take us through?
I'm glad you asked that, because my background is nursing. In the 1960s, when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross identified the 5 stages of grief, we thought we were going to be able to talk to patients and the public about what to expect in terms of stages. But more recently, especially with the Grief Recovery Institute researching grief worldwide, and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross herself coming forward and saying that these stages were not meant for people who were grieving. They were meant for people who were facing a fatal illness. So when I'm saying to somebody, these are the stages, and they're never angry, and some people aren't, they come back and they say, I'm not processing well. I'm not processing this because I've never felt angry, or I've never felt like bargaining, or I've never been in denial. So we kind of describe the grief journey, and there's only one rule in the grief journey, only one. There's no stages, and the rule is there is no rule. You need to listen to your little voice, what you need to do to process this tremendous loss.
And I think that, it kind of stems back to the individuality that goes along with grief as a whole. I mean, everybody's going to, deal with things differently. I just wanted to go back to PTSD for a second, and that, of course, people associate that with the military,
right,
more so than, quote unquote, individuals.
Right.
But it really it's a cascading kind of illness that can affect absolutely anybody.
I agree, Quinn. I kind of tend to shy away from the term PTSD because I like it applied to the military, I guess. But on the other hand, what I would say about that is I see PTSD more as an illness, perhaps. That would be my definition. Doesn't mean that it's correct. I'd like to, repeat that grief is a normal, natural, healthy human process. And so that's why I kind of differentiate between the two. For some people, what they go through will be certainly more difficult than others. That can lead to chemical imbalances even, and to, as you and I both know, drastic personality changes and actions. So I do like to look at grief, normal grief, as even though this feels very abnormal to have to process. In our society, we don't do a good teaching of letting people know that in life there will be losses. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so when we realize that this process It's something that has to be experienced, and we have to face it in order to go through it. I use the analogy of a broken leg. If you break your leg, people aren't going to expect you to walk on it tomorrow and get over it. And they're not going to compare your broken leg to somebody else's broken leg. The pain is yours, and it is a process. And yes, the body helps your bones knit, even if you walk on that broken leg, but it doesn't heal as properly as if you had the cast on, the cast being the support, to know that this is a normal and natural event. And I wish we talked about grief and cortisol and normal life losses in school, so that people would realize before we get to be adults, they wouldn't be shocked by how could this possibly happen to me. That's a normal response initially, of course, but it's also recognizing that there will be hard things in life that we will have to process. That's why we have other people to help us along.
Once people are allowed back in their communities, they're going to find either their homes destroyed or damaged. And then they've got a whole different process to deal with insurance companies and adjusters and all of that. Any suggestions, Bertha, on how people should deal with those steps to try and reduce the stress and anxiety that's going to be there anyway?
I wish I did. I really wish I did. But, all of us are thinking of, and there's going to be obstacles that we're not even aware of, in terms of dealing with, depends on what insurance company you have. It depends on what support you have, depends on whether you can access programs online. I think the province is trying to help people and sort of create a moving forward, package kind of thing. So the only advice I would have is you better ask questions, and asking questions of the right people, and that wouldn't be me.
I can't imagine how terrified people must be, those who have lost their homes and displaced, the firefighters.
Right.
So is there going to be cases of fear in people? Could this happen again every time they see or smell smoke? That's a terrifying thing, as many of us have experienced the last few weeks.
I live not far from the highway, so I hear the sirens. I don't mind the sirens, but I have since this fire started, and I'm not connected to the fire. So I think I'm pretty normal on most days. But I can imagine that if I was living in that area, no question, especially when you're hearing a lot of people talking about this is global warming and, we're going to get this and we're going to get that. It's a matter of trying to sort out fact from fear. Don't follow Facebook unless you're following Sean Hatfield. It's like a lot of people will come up with their own ideas about where the future is going to be. So, people around here, we're pretty smart, Nova Scotians, Canadians. It's sort of like, and we've been through difficult things before, and I mean that generationally, in terms of the wars, in terms of the depression, in terms of, and people have survived because they've maybe thought for themselves rather than go to that fear factor. But initially, will you be fearful? Will we all be fearful? If we're human, I think we will. And until we can kind of relax a little bit, breathe a little easier, so that every siren is not a fire that's going to come and steal your life, so to speak.
We mentioned earlier the outpouring of community support from across the province, across the country, really.
Right.
And all the volunteers showing up at the centers to help the evacuees and their families. How important is that in terms of making people feel a bit more at ease?
It's huge. It's huge. I have been doing grief recovery now for decades, and I hear even the smallest word can make a big difference to a person, let alone what's gone on there in terms of people being supportive, people just offering, your bill paid at the garage and your hair cut, paid for, and all the stuff that's been donated. So it's huge. It's really, really huge. And words, believe it or not, sometimes are as or more valuable than material things. There's so much more going on behind the scenes, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention the nursing homes that had to be evacuated. Kudos to Burridge campus in Yarmouth for taking all the residents at Bayside home, but also the staff that made it look easy online, and it wasn't easy. Some of the staff from Shelburne had to relocate to Acadia University, leaving their families behind because they were caregivers and they were devoted to these residents. The staff from Bayside brought all their residents to Burridge campus. So there's so many other positive things that have happened in terms of the community supporting so much. Everything, even stuff that people haven't complained about, but they still have really given their all and then some.
So you mentioned, the longevity that you have with grief and grief recovery, but what sort of role does social media play in all of this? Is it a bad thing? Is it a good thing? I mean, we want you to be honest on this,
Yeah.
and we understand.
Yeah, well, let's just say that I kind of don't go on Facebook very much. I mean, there are some good things, and I have followed Facebook since the fires, of course. And again, I'll refer to Sean Hatfield, who's got this positive spin. But there's people that tend to know everything when they really don't. And so, again, the power of words. The reason that I did get off Facebook was because people were commenting about suicide and having their own ideas about why people commit suicide. And so, because I don't want to get in a fight on Facebook, we don't know what people go through. We don't know everything we think we know. So, but I will say social media in itself, there's a lot of YouTube programs on grief that is done by thanatologists, people who study grief. I have, in my grief support group, for example, I have people who rely on a lot of good information on social media. So I guess the experts...
You got to find that, though.
You have to find it, and you have to check out your source. And if it's the guy down the road who's mad at the politicians, then don't follow him or her.
There certainly is a lot of armchair generals or armchair
Yes.
warriors
Yes.
on social media in general. I think that, the fact that the province and the communities were using social media as their go-to
Right.
for information for what little bit was coming out.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to call anybody out or throw anybody under the bus, but I know that that's one of the key components from this that has been lacking is the additional official communication lines or lines of communication. But yet, because they're relying on that, you're still searching to find and make sure that you've got the official lines of communication, that
Right.
you've got the right information.
Yeah.
So are there certain folks that are on social media or certain channels on YouTube that are in line, like they're the right places to go look for this stuff?
Well, I think the government websites are probably the ones that have the most information. And when you're talking about the right information, are they looking for the right information or a timeline that suits them? Because, knowing a little bit about what's involved in people making sure that people are safe, and certainly I'm not the expert, but I do have a fair amount of colleagues who have been involved with this indirectly and directly. And it's sort of like, yeah, we would want to tell everybody what's going on yesterday. But our priorities are making sure that you're safe and making sure that the right information comes out there. So when I'm talking about government, they can be, well, they're guilty of anything, no matter what they do. So, there's that. But it is about, I think it needs, if it was my house, I'd want to know now. But
Sure.
I think I would probably realize that maybe that's not possible in light of people trying to give the best information. And I know some people were a little upset about the highway being closed and about, the fire ban. And yeah, I think it's okay for people to vent. But I guess for me, it would be the government, whether it's municipal or provincial.
You mentioned earlier that the timeline on grief varies. But I mean, from a situation like this, with as many folks that have been affected as we're hearing in the news, what's your best guess on are we talking a couple of years for this to kind of settle down, or are we talking 5 years?
See, it depends on the individuals, right? I did see a post from a family that had escaped the fires in Fort McMurray quite a few years ago, and they were saying, you're going to get through this. We now have our own home, blah, blah, blah. It's sort of like, so a lot of it has to do with mindset. And some people will probably process this in what we call the normal grief recovery, which is a couple of years. Would I think that people might adapt faster than that? Some will. Because some are grateful that they're having a place to live and that there was no loss of life. So it's difficult to really know that. I could give you some kind of an answer, but it wouldn't be factual.
Mm-hmm. I understand.
Yeah.
And just taking a step back a second to the survivor guilt, where
Right.
my neighbor's house burns
Yeah.
down, but mine doesn't.
Yeah.
That in and of itself requires a certain degree of processing too, does it not?
But again, guilt is a normal, healthy emotion. The only people who don't have guilt are psychopaths and 2-year-olds. 2-year-old will bite you and run away and laugh. People will have guilt. It's about examining why you have that guilt. Do you have that guilt because you're feeling responsible? Are you guilty of blame for what happened? Do you have a misassumption of control that you think you could have solved this? Or do you have a low self-esteem that makes you feel that you should feel guilty because you've been made to feel guilty all your life? And let me clarify that. Nobody's made to feel guilty. We choose to listen to what people tell us about guilt. So it's about knowing that it's normal, knowing that you're probably going to have these feelings. And when I do the grief recovery, there's a lot of guilt that comes up. And most of the time is, I wish I had done this, I wish I had done that. It's about think about what you did. The assignment that we give to people feeling guilty is to write down the things that you did do. And then that kind of diminishes the things that you didn't do. Because I know as humans we think we're in control, but we're not.
I know that a few years ago, it'd be 8 years ago now, that I had my heart attack, and then I realized, and it took a while for me to cycle into it, but I realized that there's 1,000,001 things in life I cannot control.
Right.
Very, very few I can. And so I was going to focus on those and whatever with the rest, because there's nothing I can do about it. Can't do anything about the weather. It's going to be what it is. I can't deal with what other people are going to do or how they're going to process things. I have to focus on my own stuff. And that was a really hard lesson for me to adapt to. At that point in my life, I was a bit of a workaholic. I put a lot of my energy into whatever it was I was doing, and I was doing way too much. But with that, I also found that if I needed any support from a mental health perspective, there was very little of that available. And in all honesty, in the last 8 years, I haven't seen a lot of progression. We talk about it a lot. You've got Bell Let's Talk Day. A lot of things are bringing mental health out into the forefront. But have you seen over the years in doing what you do any real progress in mental health?
I'm glad you're not seeing the expressions on my face, because they would probably answer your question. I will say this. If I was working in mental health, I would feel very bad that I have to say to people who are calling that need an appointment yesterday, that I have to say to them, we can fit you in 6 or 8 months. So I'll say that. The resources just don't seem to be there. There's 1-800 numbers that you can call 24/7. The lines are busy. There's not always people that will be available. Sometimes there are. It's also a known fact that telephone conversations sometimes are not as helpful as one-on-one, face-to-face, where you can read the body language as much as you can read the verbal. And so I think we're talking about it more, and like a lot of things, maybe it takes a long time to put programs in place. That's why I volunteer my time to see people one-on-one as much as I can. And a lot of these people are people that have gone to mental health and have felt that the wait list was too long, or that we have not yet made it known that a lot of mental health issues are related to grief. So if I was, whatever grief I experienced as a child, whether it was loss of self-esteem, whether it was loss of innocence, whether it was loss of security, whether it was loss of my first puppy love experience, whether that a lot of these emotions that are shoved down will elevate the chemicals in our brain that will make us feel more anxious. And, certainly there's some physical chemical imbalances that make people have different mental experiences. But a lot of the issues that I see people having are people who don't realize that they experienced a grief process years ago and they shoved it down because it was, in our culture, told, never mind. I'll use puppy love as an example. That is a very vulnerable time for a lot of people when they get dumped. And what do we say? Oh, never mind. You'll find somebody better. There's all kinds of fish in the sea. So it's about acknowledging. If we could learn as a society to acknowledge each other's hurts and provide each other emotional support, we would be able to process a lot more. But what we do is we have created this vision that you need to be skinny, cute, tall, dark, and handsome, the expert at every sport and everything going on. And we've created this.
Well, that's 6 strikes against me.
Fake news.
I cancel out on all 6 of those. Do you think that we've created a unrealistic, in talking about that, have we created an unrealistic world for our kids to come into?
You know the answer to that.
I do.
Yeah, you do. And a lot of people out there do. Because we had this thing about we want our kids to have more than we ever had. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's only when there's no work or there's no reward associated that. I don't mean reward. I mean, if I am going to give my child everything that he wants or he needs or she needs, then there should also be consequences or actions that lead to them earning that. So that's what I hear from a lot of people. I've got too many examples of, I'm going way back now with, the parent that's buying the new car, but they can't take it to work because the child needs to bring it to school. That's just one example. So do we help that child realize that in life there's going to be some stuff that's going to be hard to overcome, but you can overcome it. If we can solve problems at a younger age, then as we get into adulthood, when we're faced with problems and our parents aren't there to give it everything that they have to make us not suffer or not cry or not feel anything, then yeah, our generation has, not to say that there's a lot of kids who are not excellent, because I have worked with many students when I was at the nursing home that came in and they knew how to clean a toilet and they knew how to work and they had good work ethics. And, when you follow social media, you see there's a lot of wonderful young people out there. Thankfully, they're going to save us. But there's also a lot of parents that have enabled, people to be dependent. I don't know how we got on this topic, but it's connects to grief.
It cycles back because then they're not prepared
Exactly.
But there's more to it. I mean, like I look at it from a standpoint, of course, that as my kid was going through school, well, school will prepare you for the real world. No, it does not.
No.
You know, they're not teaching them how to cook. They're not teaching them how to clean. I mean, we had home ec and shop.
Yeah.
I mean, and granted, that was a bit sexist in itself. I mean, home ec was the girls and shop was the guys, but that seems to have corrected itself.
Yes.
But the thing is that school does not prepare you for the real world anymore. They don't teach how to do your taxes. That's an obligation you're stuck with for years and years and years and years. It doesn't teach you how to deal with anything, including grief, which is going to come eventually. Now, I have a very small family, so I haven't had as many opportunities to have to deal with a death in the family.
Right.
At this point in my life, I've had to deal with my 2 sets of grandparents, and that's it. Whereas others have had to deal with siblings and
multiple,
as well as their parents. My parents are still living, so you know, I haven't gotten to that point yet. But I'd like to feel that, you know, when that time comes, maybe I'll be better prepared to deal with it. But going through school, I mean, you know, that seems to be, in my mind, the prime opportunity to condition folks to be able to deal with that. But if we're handing out participation trophies and everybody's a winner and there's no disappointment in anything. I mean, when I was going through school, you won or you lost. You learned how to deal with the loss, right? Be it sports or competition of any sort. But it seems that we're a little bit more concerned with not disappointing people along the way. But that cascades.
Well, that's exactly what we were talking about, that if kids have never had a disappointment of losing the volleyball, you know, which will make them feel upset for a while, then they're not going to be able to process a death at age 30 if they've been protected all along.
And that's how we got where we were.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that I would say, too, though, is I never wanted to be a teacher because I think there was a lot dumped on teachers in terms of teaching kids. And I'm saying parents need to teach kids how to do taxes. You know, that's just my opinion. But there's a lot of stuff that could be, and I think teachers teach what the curriculum tells them to teach. So it's about, you know, we used to have home and school and we could argue about that, right?
Yes.
You know, so it's about, definitely, I have seen the high school here certainly make some strides in trying to talk more about grief, and maybe that's because they've seen losses that have affected the kids, suicides and stuff. So, you know, we have a long way to go, but I agree with you, Quinn, that, you know, there's a lot of life issues that we need to talk about openly. And one of them, for me, of course, is always going back to grief. Whatever the hardships are that we're going to go through, we can get through it together, but it's a process and it's not an overnight fix. It's not a drive-through Tim Hortons, you know, fix. It is about acknowledging that we have a chemical response, a change in our body, a change in our system, change in our emotions, in our spirituality, in terms of how we feel, whether we're feeling secure, safe, peaceful, even joyful. What are some of the things that will rob us of that? And that can be lost. But guess what? There is a light at the end of the tunnel if we process it together and don't tell people how to feel.
Patients from Roseway Hospital were evacuated and relocated, as were those living at 2 nursing homes in Shelburne County. You, for a number of years, were administrator of the Kill Home for Special Care. How gargantuan a task is that to relocate residents? Obviously, there were plans in place in the event of a natural disaster. Can you tell us about that?
Every institution, nursing home, of course, there has to be disaster evacuation plans. My mind goes back to when I was at Nikhil. Our evacuation plan was the high school across the street. So I'm thinking perhaps for some nursing homes that would have been, you know, plan B, that if, and we did have a plan B, but there certainly were more plans made for that easier transition. Again, what I saw and heard was that the other nursing homes came on board and helped. Villa St. Joseph was there with their handicapped accessible bus, and, you know, different even one of the fishing companies was there to transfer some of the equipment that they would need. I would say, and I'm not saying this with any disrespect to families, but I would think one of the big issues would have been to deal with the families that were anxious about what you were going to do with the resident that was in your care. So that meant that there had to be a lot of communications from the administrator and the staff going on down, that they were going to be well looked after, they were going to be well fed. But think about people traveling from Shelburne to Acadia who are suffering with dementia, who are incontinent. There's a lot of stuff we don't know. So there's a lot of, but I will say this, that the nursing home staff have always been devoted and underpaid. And, when something like this happens, they step up to the plate and they make it look easy, which I know it wasn't.
Any final thoughts?
I would just hope that people would not make it worse by pretending that they're okay. And I will say this, like when I talk about talking being one of the tools that moves us forward, I know from being around and being old that there's a lot of people that are private, that they don't want to talk. And that's when we really encourage journaling, like writing out your emotions, screaming, but make sure that nobody hears you because they'll call 911. But, we know that there are some things that we can do that will help us process that frustration, the anger for some people, the pain, just to be able to spit that out, to make sure that we're not shoving it down, and to be mindful of what our little voice is telling us, not what somebody else is telling us, but what we know we need today and tomorrow until we get to the other side. And I will say this, there's gold nuggets in every loss, and we've already seen some in this episode, in this event.
Bertha, thank you so much for your insights and your advice. We very much appreciate it.
I appreciate you inviting me. Thank you.
I'm Gary Nickerson.
And I'm Quinn Taggart.
And this has been Outside My Window.